It was supposed to be unstoppable. A single warship, so massive, so feared, people whispered its name like a curse. Bismarck, Germany's pride. A floating fortress of steel. A ship built to break the Atlantic and starve Britain into surrender. And then in May 1941, Bismarck slipped into the cold gray ocean. Not to fight an equal fleet, but to hunt helpless convoys. To cut Britain's lifeline one ship at a time. But the Royal Navy didn't just see a warship. They saw a nightmare. Because if Bismarck reached the open Atlantic, Britain could lose the war without ever losing an army. So they launched one of the greatest manhunts in naval history. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers. An entire empire chasing one ship. And at first, Bismarck wins. In a single shocking moment, it destroys Britain's most famous battlecruiser, HMS Hood, in an explosion so sudden the world can barely process it. The sea swallows the pride of the Royal Navy, and the chase turns personal. Because now it isn't strategy, it's rage. And yet, even after that, Bismarck still isn't safe. Because the ocean is wide, but not wide enough to hide forever. Not when every radio signal, every wake line, every shadow in the storm could be the last clue. And by the time this hunt ends, you'll see how a warship that seemed invincible was brought down by something so small, so fragile, it almost feels impossible. A few old biplanes in a storm with torpedoes. And one turning moment that decided the fate of the Atlantic. Welcome back to a true story where the ocean becomes a battlefield and the weather becomes a weapon. Today's episode is a 1-hour cinematic deep dive into one of the most intense naval hunts in modern history. The hunt for the Bismarck. This isn't just about ships firing across the sea. This is a thriller built from real choices, real fear, and real moments where a single mistake meant thousands of lives. Because the Bismarck wasn't just a battleship. It was a strategic knife aimed at Britain's throat. And Britain, isolated, under siege, dependent on Atlantic supply lines, could not allow that knife to cut. So what followed was desperation on a global scale. Warships racing through storms. Pilots taking off from heaving decks. Commanders making calls they'd be judged for forever. And a haunting question hanging over the entire Royal Navy. If we don't stop Bismarck, how many will die because we failed? And what makes this story even more terrifying is that Bismarck almost escapes. More than once. Because when you're chasing a ship across a massive ocean, you don't win by bravery alone. You win by information, by timing, by luck, and by never letting your enemy breathe. So if you're here for immersive history, where every scene feels like you're standing on the deck, hearing the wind, smelling the salt, feeling the ship shake under gunfire, you're in the right place. Stay until the end, because the final moments of the Bismarck story are not just explosive. They're haunting, and they leave behind a warning every modern navy still studies today. To understand why the Bismarck terrified Britain, you have to understand the Atlantic in 1941. Britain was an island at war. Every bullet, every tank, every loaf of bread, every drop of fuel, all of it had to cross the ocean. And the Atlantic was not a highway. It was a battlefield. German U-boats were already tearing into convoys. Merchant ships vanished at night. Survivors froze in the dark water. Britain was fighting with its back against the sea. And now Germany was preparing something worse. Not a submarine. A battleship. Bismarck was not designed to win small engagements. She was designed to break systems. Built in secrecy, launched in 1939, and commissioned in 1940, Bismarck was one of the most powerful warships ever constructed. 8 15-inch guns, each shell weighing as much as a small car. Armor so thick it was measured in feet, not inches. Speed fast enough to outrun older battleships. But Bismarck's true power wasn't just firepower. It was psychological. Because one battleship loose in the Atlantic could force Britain to react everywhere. Convoys would scatter. Escorts would thin. Shipping lanes would choke. And Germany understood this perfectly. The plan was simple in concept, but deadly in execution. Bismarck would break out into the Atlantic, supported by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. They wouldn't fight fleets. They would hunt convoys, disappear, reappear, strike where Britain was weakest, and force the Royal Navy to spread itself thin. The British response? Absolute panic, wrapped in discipline. Because the Royal Navy knew one thing. The Bismarck reached the open Atlantic. There would be no easy way to stop her. Battleships were few. Carriers were stretched. And the Atlantic was enormous. That's why the moment Bismarck left port, Britain reacted as if a wildfire had been spotted near dry land. Signals went out. Fleets were repositioned. Every possible interception route was calculated. Because stopping Bismarck early was the only safe option. And this is where Germany made its own calculation. German commanders believed Bismarck's armor would protect her. That British gunnery would be inaccurate in poor weather. That surprise and speed would be enough. And in one sense, they were right. Because when the two sides finally met, Bismarck proved she was everything the British feared, and more. But before that moment, before the guns fired, before the ocean exploded, there was silence, cold, grit, and the sound of steel cutting through waves. As Bismarck sailed north, toward destiny. Once British intelligence confirmed Bismarck was at sea, the hunt began with a single obsession. Intercept her before she reaches the Atlantic. That meant one place above all others. The narrow gateways where a ship could slip through from Norway and the Baltic into open ocean. And the most dangerous of those gateways was the cold stretch of water between Greenland and Iceland. The Denmark Strait. It was more than geography. It was a choke point. A place where fog, storms, and ice could hide a battleship the way darkness hides a predator. If Bismarck passed the Denmark Strait, she would have room to vanish, room to hunt, room to turn the Atlantic into a killing ground. So the Royal Navy threw what it could into the path. Cruisers were positioned as watchers, eyes in the mist. Battleships and battlecruisers rushed to intercept. And at the center of the British response was a name that carried history like a crown. HMS Hood. Hood wasn't just a ship. She was a symbol. The pride of the Royal Navy. For years, Hood was the face of British sea power. Sleek, famous, admired. But Hood had a weakness that would become fatal. She was a battlecruiser, fast, heavily armed, but not armored like a true battleship. In peacetime, that trade-off made sense. In a duel with Bismarck, it was a terrifying gamble. Alongside Hood sailed the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales, powerful, modern, but still inexperienced, still working through mechanical issues and crew training. On paper, Britain had firepower, but not certainty. And the men aboard Hood knew it. They were sailing into an encounter where one lucky hit could erase them. In the gray northern waters, the British force cut through fog and cold spray. Visibility shifted hour by hour. Sometimes the horizon vanished entirely. Sometimes it opened just enough to show how empty and how enormous the sea truly was. And then came the moment every officer feared. The cruisers shadowing Bismarck finally made contact. The Germans were there, moving fast. And both sides understood what was about to happen. This would not be a long chase. It would be a collision, a sudden, brutal exchange of shells. In one of the most unforgiving seas on Earth, the British hoped to close distance quickly, reducing Bismarck's advantage and bringing both British ships' guns to bear. The Germans hoped to keep range, use their superior fire control, and hit first. And above them all, the sky was low and heavy, the kind of sky that feels like it's pressing down on the ocean. A storm sky. A hunter's sky. The ships moved into firing position. Turrets rotated. Rangefinders locked on. And on the bridge of HMS Hood, men stared into the mist, waiting for a shape to become a target. They didn't know. They couldn't know that within minutes, the most famous ship in the Royal Navy would be gone. At 5:52 a.m. on May 24, 1941, the fog opens just enough, and two fleets finally see each other. To the men on the bridges, it isn't a cinematic reveal. It's a sudden, stomach-tightening shock. Two gray giants, emerging from gray mist, in gray ocean, under gray sky. HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales turn to engage. Bismarck and Prinz Eugen hold course. For a few seconds, there's only distance and decision. Then the first shells fire. The sound is not one sound. It's a sequence of violence. A thunder crack as a turret fires. A deep concussion traveling through steel decks. A shock wave that hits the chest like a punch. Water erupts where shells land short, towering white columns that collapse back into the sea. Both sides are trying to lock in range. Both sides are trying to find the perfect rhythm. And this is where one small mistake begins to matter. In the confusion, the British initially target the wrong ship. Hood fires on Prinz Eugen, the cruiser, not Bismarck. It's an understandable error in low visibility, silhouettes overlapping. But in a battle measured in seconds, it's deadly. Because while Hood is throwing shells at the wrong target, Bismarck is doing what she was built to do. Finding Hood's range. Bismarck's gunnery team works with terrifying calm. Rangefinders. Fire control tables. Corrections. Then Bismarck's second salvo lands close. Too close. The sea around Hood becomes a storm of geysers. Prince of Wales joins the fight, firing heavy shells at Bismarck. But Prince of Wales is new. Her crew is inexperienced. Her guns aren't perfectly reliable yet. The battle becomes uneven. Not because Britain lacks courage, but because the moment is chaotic. And then something happens aboard Hood. Prinz Eugen's shells ignite a fire on Hood's deck, possibly in the ammunition ready-use lockers or near the boats. Flames begin to rise. Not huge yet, but visible. And now Hood is fighting with fire on her skin, under enemy gunfire, in freezing ocean. The British want to close the distance fast. They turn slightly to bring more guns to bear. They believe if they can get closer, they can overwhelm Bismarck. But closing the distance means exposing Hood's greatest weakness. Her deck armor. Hood was fast and famous, but her deck protection was thinner than a true battleship's. And Bismarck's shells fall from high trajectories. If one penetrates the wrong place, it can reach the magazines, the heart of the ship. That's what makes the next moment so horrifying. Because when it happens, it isn't gradual. There's no warning. No time to understand. One moment Hood is firing and turning. The next moment, the ship is gone. It happens in seconds. A shell, most likely from Bismarck, finds the one place it cannot be allowed to reach. The forward magazines. The ship's stored ammunition. And then HMS Hood explodes. Not like a ship sinking. Not like a ship burning. This is a detonation so violent that eyewitnesses struggle to describe it. The flash. A roar that feels larger than sound. A tower of fire erupting from the ship's center. And the pride of the Royal Navy breaks apart like it's made of paper. The blast is so sudden, so complete, that for a moment, the minds watching it don't accept it. They stare, waiting for Hood to reappear. But it doesn't. Because Hood isn't sinking like a wounded ship. Hood is being erased. Her hull splits. Her deck disappears. In less than 3 minutes, she is gone. Over 1,400 men are in the water. Only 3 survive. 3. That number spreads across the Royal Navy like a cold curse. And suddenly, the Battle of the Denmark Strait isn't just a battle anymore. It's trauma. It's outrage. It's disbelief turning into determination. On the bridge of Prince of Wales, officers watch the smoke and debris where Hood used to be. The crew keeps fighting, but now they're fighting through shock. Prince of Wales fires again and again. Some shells strike Bismarck. And at least one of those hits matters. Because Bismarck takes damage. Fuel tanks are ruptured. Oil begins leaking into the sea, a dark trail, a signature. Her speed remains high. But her mission has been compromised. Now the German commander faces his own choice. Continue into the Atlantic as planned, or turn toward France for repair. He chooses France. Because a battleship cannot raid effectively if it's bleeding fuel. And now the chase begins in full. Because the British don't just want Bismarck stopped. They want vengeance. News of Hood's destruction hits Britain like a punch in the gut. This wasn't some obscure ship. This was a national icon. And within hours, a message spreads through the Royal Navy, a command that becomes legend. Sink the Bismarck. It becomes more than strategy, more than logic. It becomes a mission of honor. Every British ship within reach is ordered to join the hunt. Cruisers shadow Bismarck through fog. Destroyers race into the storm. Carriers reposition. Battleships alter course. The Atlantic becomes a net tightening around one ship. But the ocean is vast, and Bismarck is fast. And here's the terrifying truth Britain now understands. If Bismarck escapes, she won't just raid convoys. She will haunt the Atlantic like a ghost. And Britain will never feel safe again. So the Royal Navy pursues with relentless pressure. But the closer they get, the more dangerous it becomes. Because Bismarck is wounded, but still lethal. And a wounded predator is often the most terrifying kind. After the explosion of HMS Hood, the ocean falls silent again. Not peaceful. Smoke drifts where a legend once sailed. Debris floats briefly, then disappears beneath the waves. And Bismarck turns south. Damaged, leaking fuel, but still moving at speed. The German commander knows two things now. First, he has struck a blow that will echo through history. Second, every ship Britain has will now come for him. So Bismarck runs. Not in panic. In calculation. Her engines push through heavy seas as she heads for the safety of occupied France, toward ports protected by Luftwaffe aircraft and coastal defenses. Behind her, British cruisers shadow at distance. They don't engage. They watch. They report. Every course change. Every speed adjustment. Every glimpse through fog and rain. But then, the Atlantic intervenes. Weather worsens. Rain slashes visibility to nothing. Waves rise. And somewhere in that chaos, the unthinkable happens. Britain loses Bismarck. Radio contact falters. Visual contact vanishes. Radar returns nothing. The ocean swallows the ship whole. For hours, the Royal Navy doesn't know where she is. And that moment, those hours, are among the most dangerous of the entire hunt. Because if Bismarck slips through now, she reaches France. She repairs. She returns to sea. And the Atlantic nightmare begins again. British commanders feel the pressure closing in. They've committed enormous forces. They've lost Hood. And now the enemy has vanished. Somewhere in the gray distance, a single battleship is deciding the fate of convoys that feed an entire nation. This is where the hunt becomes psychological. Because chasing a visible enemy is hard. Chasing an invisible one is torment. Admirals argue over maps. Some believe Bismarck has doubled back. Others believe she has turned west. Others fear she's already broken free. Every wrong assumption costs time. And time favors the runner. Then, finally, hope arrives from an unexpected direction. An aircraft carrier. HMS Royal. She is not fast. Her aircraft are not modern. Her torpedo planes are outdated biplanes, fabric wings, open cockpits, slow and vulnerable. But she has something battleships don't. Royal's aircraft begin searching the ocean in widening arcs. Pilots fly low over waves, eyes burning from wind and salt. Hour after hour. Fuel gauges dropping. And then, someone sees something. A long, dark shape. A wake line cutting through the sea. A ship. Confirmation comes back through radio static. Bismarck has been found again. And now the final phase begins. Because the Royal Navy understands something crucial. If they lose contact again, there may not be a third chance. They must strike. And the only weapon that can reach Bismarck before nightfall is the one no one expected to decide the battle. Slow, fragile, flying into a storm. A torpedo plane. The pilots on HMS Royal know the odds. They're flying fairy swordfish torpedo planes, slow, fabric-winged biplanes that look like they belong to another era. Open cockpits. No armor worth mentioning. Speed so low it feels insulting compared to modern fighters. Against a battleship like Bismarck, it sounds like suicide. But here's the truth about war. Sometimes the weapon that changes everything isn't the newest. It's the one that arrives at the right time. A storm is building over the Atlantic. Wind whips the sea into violent peaks. Waves smash against the carrier deck as swordfish planes roll forward to launch. Their engines roar, fighting rain and spray. And then they lift off, one after another, into gray sky. The pilots are soaked. Visibility is horrible. The horizon is a smear of mist and ocean. And somewhere ahead, Bismarck is running for France. The swordfish fly low, almost touching the waves. They have to. They're hunting a target that can disappear in clouds and sea spray. Finally, they see it. A dark shape. A massive shape. Bismarck cuts through the storm like a moving cliff. Even wounded, she looks invincible. On Bismarck's deck, the crew spots the incoming planes. They're confused at first. Biplanes? Slow. Almost laughable. But then the laughter dies. Because slow doesn't mean harmless. Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns open up. The sky erupts with tracer fire. Shells burst around the swordfish, black puffs, flashes, spray fountains where rounds hit the sea. The biplanes keep coming anyway. The pilots fight the wind, line up their runs, and descend even lower. So low that the sea spray slaps their faces. So low that one mistake means they skip into the water. And for a moment, it feels impossible. The swordfish are crawling forward, while the battleship is a wall of steel and fire. But the storm is doing something strange. It's protecting them. The rain reduces visibility. The waves disrupt the gunfire. The swordfish planes aren't clean targets. They're ghosting in and out of mist. One torpedo drops. Then another. White wakes streaking toward the battleship. Bismarck tries to maneuver. She turns hard, throwing her weight against the ocean. But she's a giant ship, and the sea is brutal. A hit. Not the kind that blows the ship apart. Not the kind that turns it into flames. Something worse. A torpedo strikes near the stern. The shock travels through the ship like a hammer. And suddenly, Bismarck's steering begins to fail. At first, it's subtle. A sluggish response. A delayed turn. Then it becomes obvious. The ship can't correct course properly. The rudder is jammed. Bismarck begins to turn in wide circles, like a wounded animal trying to run but finding its legs won't obey. And in that moment, Bismarck loses the one thing a raider must never lose. Freedom of movement. Because a battleship can survive hits. But it cannot survive being trapped. The swordfish return, some damaged, some barely holding together. They land on Ark Royal in brutal conditions. And the pilots report what they did. They didn't sink Bismarck. But they may have done something more important. They stopped her from escaping. Now the Royal Navy closes in. Battleships racing through night. Destroyers preparing for torpedo attacks. And Bismarck is turning helplessly in the storm, waiting for the final blow. Night falls over the Atlantic, and the storm becomes a cloak. Bismarck is still afloat, still armed, still dangerous. But she is no longer in control of her own direction. Her rudder is jammed, her steering compromised, and instead of cutting toward France, she turns and turns in wide, helpless circles. Inside the ship, German sailors fight the problem like surgeons trying to stop a patient from bleeding out. Teams rush below decks. Tools slam against metal. Orders echo through tight corridors. They try to free the rudder. They try to fix the steering gear. They try to regain the one advantage that matters now: movement. But the sea doesn't give them time. By night, British destroyers arrive. Small ships compared to Bismarck, fast, aggressive, built to strike and vanish. They aren't coming to trade gunfire with the battleship. They're coming to do what destroyers do best: harass, confuse, torpedo. They circle in the darkness, using the storm like cover. And Bismarck responds with everything she has. Her guns fire into the night, huge flashes of light that illuminate the waves for a fraction of a second. Every blast is like lightning. The destroyers dodge. They weave. They close in and break away. They launch torpedoes, some missing, some forcing Bismarck to twist and turn even more. It becomes a night of exhaustion. Not just physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion. On Bismarck, men stand at their stations hour after hour, soaked, cold, tense, waiting for the next attack. On the destroyers, Crews brace for the moment when one unlucky shell could tear them apart. And the storm rages over all of it: wind, spray, darkness. This isn't a glamorous battle. It's warfare as endurance, as pressure, as sleep deprivation, as fear stretched thin. By the time dawn begins to creep into the sky, both sides are exhausted. But Bismarck is worse. She is alone. Her fuel is leaking. Her crew is drained. Her steering is still crippled. And now, as the darkness fades, the world becomes clear again. And in the growing light, Bismarck sees something that feels like a death sentence. 2 battleships on the horizon, HMS King George V and HMS Rodney. These are not destroyers. These are executioners. Heavy guns, thick armor, massive shells designed to tear steel apart. And behind them, cruisers and more ships form a tightening ring. Bismarck, the hunter of the Atlantic, is now the one being hunted. The German commander understands what is coming. There will be no escape, no maneuvering out of range, no slipping into fog, no running for France. Only one last act remains: fight until the ship can't fight. The crew prepares. They load shells. They brace against the deck. They know this will be close-range gunfire, brutal, relentless, unending. And the British? The British crews feel something different. Not fear, at least not only fear. Something heavier. A sense of inevitability. Because sinking Bismarck isn't just about removing a ship. It's about closing a wound. It's about proving Hood didn't die in vain. It's about ending the nightmare before it reaches the shipping lanes. As the British battleships approach, the sea feels strangely calm compared to the night. The storm begins to break. The horizon clears. And now everyone can see exactly what's about to happen. A crippled giant, facing the full weight of an empire. And the next hour will decide whether Bismarck dies as a legend or escapes as a terror. Morning comes slowly over the Atlantic. The storm pulls back just enough to reveal the truth. Bismarck is still there. Scarred, crippled, but unbroken. Her superstructure is damaged. Her decks are littered with wreckage. Her fuel slick stains the sea around her. Yet her guns are still pointed outward. And that fact matters. Because as HMS Rodney and HMS King George V close the distance, something unsettling happens. This is no longer a hunt. It is an execution. But executions can still be dangerous. The British battleships open fire. The sound is overwhelming, deep, rolling thunder that seems to shake the ocean itself. Shells the size of small cars tear across the distance. They hit Bismarck again and again. Armor shatters. Steel peels away. Turrets are smashed. Fire breaks out across the ship. And yet, Bismarck keeps firing. Not accurately. Not effectively. But defiantly. Some of her shells fall short. Some land wide. A few come dangerously close. The British don't rush. They don't need to. They circle and pound the battleship methodically, shot after shot, minute after minute. And here's the twist that makes this moment uncomfortable. Bismarck does not sink because of one fatal blow. She is dismantled. Systematically. Relentlessly. Her guns are knocked out one by one. Her command spaces are destroyed. Her fire control systems are ruined. By mid-morning, Bismarck is no longer a fighting ship. She is a floating wreck. But she is still afloat. This is where the story becomes morally complex. Because the British now face a choice. They could pull away and leave Bismarck to sink slowly. But they don't. They continue firing. They launch torpedoes. They make absolutely certain the ship will not survive. But because Britain cannot afford uncertainty. Not after Hood. Not after weeks of fear. Not after the cost already paid. And inside Bismarck, the German crew understands the reality. The ship cannot be saved. The guns are silent. The fires are out of control. Water is flooding in. So the final order is given. Scuttle the ship. Open the valves. Destroy the systems. Let Bismarck sink on German terms, not British ones. As explosions rock the interior and seawater rushes in, the crew begins abandoning ship. Men climb down ropes. They jump into freezing water. They cling to debris. Some sing quietly. Some pray. Some simply stare at the sky. And then Bismarck begins to list. Slowly at first. Then more sharply. The giant that terrified an empire tilts and disappears beneath the waves. The sea closes over her like it closes over everything else. In the end, Bismarck is gone. But here's the uncomfortable truth. She did not die because she was weak. She died because she was alone. Because in modern war, even the most powerful weapon cannot survive isolation. And this is the real turning point of the story. Not the explosion of Hood. Not the torpedo from a biplane. But the realization, on every navy in the world, that surface giants, no matter how strong, cannot operate alone anymore. Power has limits. And those limits are enforced by coordination, air power, and information. Bismarck's end is not glorious. It's sobering. And that's what makes it unforgettable. When the last shots fade, the Atlantic becomes quiet in a way that feels unnatural. Not peaceful. Haunted. Because the ocean is covered with survivors. Men in the water. Men clinging to debris. Men calling out through wind and spray, their voices swallowed by distance. The Bismarck has sunk. But the story is not over. Because now comes the part that history often rushes through. The part that doesn't fit neatly into victory. The Royal Navy begins rescue operations. Boats are lowered. Lines are thrown. British sailors pull German survivors from freezing water. Some are too weak to speak. Some stare with empty eyes. Some whisper words that sound like apologies or disbelief. For a brief moment, war feels suspended. Not forgiven, but paused. Men helping men. Enemies becoming simply human bodies trying not to die. And then, reality returns. A warning comes in. U-boats are nearby. German submarines are converging on the area. And the British commanders face another impossible decision. Do they keep rescuing and risk being torpedoed? Or do they pull away and leave survivors behind? They pull away. The rescue is cut short. Hundreds are left in the water. And the Atlantic does what it always does. It takes them. This becomes one of the most painful aftershocks of the Bismarck story. Not because Britain was cruel, but because war forces choices where mercy can get you killed. And that is the psychological climax. Because by this moment, everyone involved has seen too much. The British have lost Hood, an icon, a symbol of empire. The Germans have lost Bismarck, a weapon, a promise, a myth. And both sides have paid in lives that vanish into cold water with no graves. Back in Britain, the news is received with a strange blend of triumph and exhaustion. Yes, Bismarck is gone. The Atlantic lifeline is safer. But the cost has been enormous. And the knowledge is sobering. There will be more hunts. More convoys sunk. More nights of sonar echoes and sudden explosions. The war at sea doesn't end when one ship sinks. It simply shifts to the next threat. In Germany, propaganda tries to reshape the story. Bismarck is portrayed as heroic. Invincible until overwhelmed. A symbol of courage. But inside the Kriegsmarine, the reality is grim. Bismarck's mission failed. Not because the ship couldn't fight, but because it couldn't survive the modern battlefield alone. This is what makes the hunt for Bismarck emotionally powerful. It isn't just good versus evil. It's a demonstration of what war does to human beings. It turns oceans into cemeteries. It forces compassion to compete with survival. It makes victory and tragedy happen in the same breath. And as the British ships steam away, leaving behind empty water, there is one final, haunting realization. Bismarck did not just sink. A whole era sank with her. The era of the lone surface battleship dominating the sea. Because from this point forward, sea power belongs to something else. Something that can reach beyond the horizon. Something that can strike without being seen. And every navy in the world understands it now. The future is not just steel. The future is the sky. The sinking of Bismarck didn't end the Battle of the Atlantic, but it changed the way the Atlantic was fought. Because Bismarck was more than a ship. She was a concept. The concept that a single surface raider, fast, armored, heavily armed, could break Britain's lifeline. That concept terrified the British for a reason. Britain depended on shipping like lungs depend on air. And Bismarck threatened to choke it. So when Bismarck went down, Britain didn't just feel relief. Britain felt a shift in strategic gravity. The Royal Navy had proven something vital. No matter how powerful a surface ship is, if it's found, it can be hunted. And if it's hunted, it can be killed. That realization changed German planning. After Bismarck, Germany became far more cautious about risking major surface units in open ocean. The big ships didn't vanish entirely from the war, but their use became restrained, selective, haunted by the memory of May 1941. Because what killed Bismarck wasn't just British courage. It was British coordination. Cruisers shadowing in the mist. Battleships closing from multiple directions. A carrier launching aircraft in a storm. Destroyers harassing at night. A net that kept tightening. This is the key strategic lesson. In modern war, the most powerful weapon isn't always the largest. It's the system. And Britain's system, despite losses, worked. Now look at what Britain learned operationally. First, tracking matters more than engagement. The cruisers that shadowed Bismarck weren't glamorous. They didn't deliver the final blow. But without them, the battle might never have happened. Second, air power extends the ocean. Ark Royal Swordfish didn't sink Bismarck. They broke her escape. They stole her mobility. They turned the sea into a cage. And that role, air power as the cage builder, becomes a defining feature of naval warfare. Third, weather is a weapon. The storm protected the Swordfish. It hit them. It disrupted Bismarck's gunnery. It turned older, slower aircraft into lethal surprise. That's the kind of detail commanders never forget. After Bismarck, Britain also understood something psychologically. The destruction of Hood had been a national wound. Sinking Bismarck closed that wound, at least partially. It restored a sense of control. A sense that Britain's navy could still protect the lifeline. And morale matters. When you're fighting a long war, morale is fuel. Germany, meanwhile, drew a different psychological lesson. Victory can trigger overreach. Bismarck's destruction of Hood was dramatic, but it also triggered Britain's full fury. The hunt became relentless. And once Bismarck was crippled, Germany could not protect her. Not in the open Atlantic. Not against an empire's network. So surface raiding, at least at that scale, became a far riskier bet. But the war didn't become easier, because the Atlantic threat didn't disappear. It shifted. From battleships to submarines. From dramatic duels to invisible terror. The U-boats would still keep sinking ships. Convoys would still burn at night. Men would still freeze in the dark. Bismarck's end didn't remove the Atlantic nightmare. It removed the Atlantic monster that everyone could see. And in some ways, what replaced it was even more frightening. Because you can hunt a battleship if you find it. But you can't easily hunt what you can't see. That's why Bismarck's story sits at a crossroads. It's the last great legend of surface battleship terror. And a preview of what modern war becomes. A war of detection, networks, and reach beyond the horizon. And that's the resolution. Bismarck's sinking didn't end the battle. It ended an era. The hunt for Bismarck is often told like an old naval legend. But it's also a blueprint. Because what happened in May 1941 wasn't just a clash of steel. It was the birth of a modern concept. The kill chain. Today, militaries use satellites, drones, radar networks, and data fusion. But the logic is the same as it was in 1941. Find the target. Track the target. Fix the target's position. Then strike. Bismarck's story is a kill chain story. Britain didn't win because one ship was stronger. Britain won because it built a chain that didn't break. Cruisers found and shadowed the target. Radio reports fed commanders. Battleships repositioned to intercept. A carrier launched aircraft to slow the target. Destroyers harassed it overnight. And finally, heavy guns finished it. That's not a single victory. That's a system executing. And modern navies are built around the same principle, just faster. Another modern lesson is something Bismarck proved painfully. Mobility is survival. The most decisive moment of the hunt isn't the final gun duel. It's the moment the swordfish torpedo jams the rudder. Because when Bismarck loses steering, she loses the ability to escape. She becomes predictable. And predictability is death in naval warfare. Today, the same thing applies. A ship doesn't have to be sunk immediately to be defeated. If you disable its movement, disrupt its sensors, or compromise its communications, you've effectively trapped it. That's why modern anti-ship missiles aren't only about destroying hulls. They're about degrading systems, radars, engines, command networks. The third lesson is about air power. The swordfish biplanes were obsolete on paper, but they changed the war at sea anyway. Because the sea can't protect you from the sky. And once aircraft carriers became common, surface ships alone were no longer enough. That's the shift Bismarck represents. She's one of the last surface giants to try to dominate without complete air cover. And she dies partly because air power reaches her when heavy guns cannot. Today, that role is expanded by drones, stealth aircraft, and long-range missiles. But the principle remains. If you don't control the air and information environment, your ship becomes a target, not a weapon. The fourth lesson is psychological, something militaries still struggle with. Symbolic assets create strategic pressure. Bismarck wasn't just a ship. She was a symbol of German sea power. That made her politically important and strategically risky. Britain couldn't ignore her. Germany couldn't easily withdraw her without losing face. So the hunt intensified beyond logic. Modern powers face similar dynamics today with aircraft carriers, flagship warships, strategic bombers, and nuclear submarines. They are assets, but also symbols. And symbols can drag nations into escalation. Finally, Bismarck teaches a timeless warning. A single, invincible weapon can make you overconfident. Bismarck's strength was real. But strength alone didn't guarantee survival. Because modern war punishes isolation. It punishes predictability. And it punishes the belief that armor equals safety. The hunt for Bismarck still matters today. Because it shows how an empire doesn't defeat a monster by matching its power. It defeats the monster by locating it, trapping it, and striking when it can't run. And once that logic exists, it never disappears. And that was the hunt for the Bismarck. A story that proves the ocean doesn't care how powerful you are. It cares whether you can run, whether you can hide, whether you can stay unseen long enough to survive. Because Bismarck didn't fall because she lacked firepower. She fell because the world around her changed. The sky mattered more than armor. Information mattered more than pride. And once the hunt began, there was no place left to vanish. If you enjoyed this kind of immersive history storytelling, where we don't just explain events, we pull you into them, make sure you subscribe. Because the next stories get even darker and even more intense. Next, we're going to dive into a battle that took place in the same unforgiving Atlantic. A battle fought mostly at night, where ships vanished without warning. And the enemy wasn't a battleship at all. It was something you couldn't see, until it was too late. A war of submarines, sonar, depth charges, and fear. If you want that story, subscribe now. And if you made it all the way to the end of this hunt, comment the word Bismarck. I read the comments. And it tells me you want more 1-hour cinematic war stories, one mission, one chase, one outcome, told like a thriller.